If your gray matter is rotten enough to watch this channel on the regular, you may have noticed that we sometimes refer to this type of specimen right here as Kevin. Many of you may be confused by the strange naming of these individuals with W skills and Radan armor, so I believe a video about them has been long overdue. And you'll be surprised to know that their categorization is much more than just a funny nickname. It's actually the noticing of a phenomenon that has been affecting the Souls genre for quite a while. But first, what is a Kevin? To keep it simple, Kevin is the type of player to put the bare minimum effort in order to beat the game. They do not learn, they look up builds and guides online before they even start their playthrough, and they choose to get carried by their friends or random players whenever possible. Be it because the game is too much for them, because they wanna be done with it as fast as possible, or a combination of both. Whatever the fuck is their issue. And what I believe to be the most defining feature of Kevin's is the fact that they will complain. They will complain about everything. They will complain about the game. They will complain about PvP. They will complain about invaders. Complain. That's the worst part, I believe. Because bad players, there are plenty. But people who complain instead of, getting better, I don't like those. It's the antithesis of what a Souls player should stand for, overcoming the game's challenges by sheer resilience and resolve. We sometimes jokingly call players we run into Kevins because they just fit the profile, they just look like them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they fit into all of these characteristics we just described. They just look goofy. They use the common PvE stuff such as Radan armor, Rivers of Blood, Bloodhound's Fang, Blasphemous Blade, Lion's Claw, etc., etc. We just call them like that as a joke, but we don't mean that they are, actual Kevins. Now, the question that may arise here is if there's something inherently wrong with Kevins existing. To which I say, no, not at all. Why would there be a problem? I just think that it's a pretty interesting topic, since the dawn of Kevins has been tremendous in the last few years with the release of Elden Ring. Like I mentioned, the existence of these players is extremely ironic considering the type of game we are talking about, a type of game that one would think attracts a different kind of gamer. But being so goddamn massive, it's normal that Elden Ring attracted many different kinds of people to the lands between, and not just the average John Dark Souls. And speaking of John Dark Souls, since I know there's some of them among my little puggies, I made a poll to ask you guys what you think Kevins are. So let's take a look at some of your comments. Full Radan armor, only presses L2 and mains any of the following weapons. Bloodhound's Fang, bonus points if they have Bloodflame Blade 2, Rivers of Blood, Gunbale, and Blasphemous Blade. I would say it's a pretty fair assessment, and yeah, most of the Kevins are just like that, full Radan, and some of these PvE-friendly weapons that you see all the time. I feel like the term is actually different depending on who you ask. I've seen people use it to insult and others to joke around. To me, a Kevin is a low-skill player fashioning the Radan's armor. Having a Readers in hand helps the look as well. Alright, so we are starting to see a pattern here. It seems that the definition of Kevins of many people seem to be quite fashion-oriented. So let's see what else there is. I would say this is the best one I've seen in the poll. Definition of a Kevin to me is as follows. Buys the game because it's popular, gets wrecked, whines about it, gets OP weapon and cheeses bosses, complains about the game being too easy, or too hard, may I add, and beats the game once and brags about it. I added 2 points because of course I had, complains that his L2 spamming doesn't work in PvP, and cries about invasions on Reddit. I think the important thing to highlight about this comment is that Kevins are no longer attributed only a distinctive physical trait, but also a behavioral one. And I believe this further deepens the term beyond just saying Radan armor equals Kevin. Kevins are basically tourists. I like them. It's entertaining to invade and follow them in secret, observing how they engage with the game. They're almost cute in a way. The plot, like my gravy, thickens, because now we have a new definition. They are tourists, which fits with what I said about the game being massive and attracting a new kind of player. Full Radan armor, never touched PvP. That's a good point. Kevins don't usually like to engage with PvP, but it does happen sometimes. as you can see. Players that avoid critical thought, fighting at you rather than against you, they will button mash thinking you won't dodge, dodge thinking you won't roll catch them, as if you are just another part of the PvE. This is a really important thing to take into account because Kevins do not differentiate PvE from PvP. They will just do whatever they are used to do and they won't give a single fuck about it. Kevin option is definitely the most appropriate for a player who cheeses the game. Low-skill players have a different nickname. We call them noobs. This one is interesting because it makes a big differentiation. It's not the same being a Kevin as being a noob. Noobs eventually improve. Kevins do not. Alright, I can see some of you puggies have been doing your homework. We got a pretty good grasp of what Kevins are, but knowing just what they are is not really going to cut it for this video, will it? We need to have more insight into their mentality and behavior. So in order to help us with that, I summoned... Get it? What I think is the real John Dark Souls of Elden Ring PvP and player behavior, Emotional John.
Thanks for having me, waifu. I'm Emotional John, and I run a YouTube channel focused on Souls PvP analysis where I dive into the more conceptual nature of invasions and how players should engage with both PvP and Souls games broadly. I tend to do a lot of critical analysis of Elden Ring and try to critique it with as much nuance and perspective as I can. Most of my content is geared toward players familiar with the Souls series and invasions, but I'm constantly addressing players who want nothing to do with them, who have had bad experiences or just don't like it, or have no real grasp on the system in general, so hopefully I have some useful insights into how an average Kevin interacts with the game.
Thanks for being here, John. Gotta say that I really admire your dedication to the topic. So, for the first question, what would you say is the driving mentality behind Kevins in Elden Ring?
I've encountered my share of Kevins over the years, and if I had to pick a rationale, I'd probably say it's some combination of frustration and unrealistic expectations. Souls games have this unique way of stressing out the player by making them make constant, rapid decisions in the face of overwhelming adversity. They can also feel directionless. There's not a constant waypoint leading you to your next objective, and there's no obvious order of operations. Even your build has so many points of articulation where there's no clear presentation of which stats to level or which items are better than others. Well, that's what so many players love about the series. For anyone who isn't accustomed to the mechanics or willing to put in the time to learn, it can be too much, which, in turn, gives way to frustration. Modern gaming is pretty notorious for avoiding challenging players for fear of harming sales, which conditions modern gamers to expect things to be accommodating. Elden Ring, despite being part of a series lauded for defying industry trends, had major mainstream hype and drew in players who otherwise would never touch something with "Prepare to Die" written on the box. As a result, you get Kevins haplessly wandering around and getting themselves killed by very avoidable circumstances. They get irritated when the game isn't what they expected, and they look for the easiest alternative, usually by disengaging as much as possible. Summons, spirit ashes, overpowered ashes of war, the whole nine. Melted cheese on the broccoli of self-improvement. Anything to make the game palatable. They're playing out of curiosity or obligation or just buying into the hype, all while failing to adapt their expectations and end up cheating themselves out of a lot of the experience just to avoid learning a hard lesson. It's well established players tend to minimize friction when given the chance. Kevins are merely doing what comes naturally. Only, for Kevins, their willingness to minimize friction is so overwhelming that it consumes any tenacity they might have otherwise developed.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me how today's players just want to avoid friction altogether for some reason. It's as if they will die if they just die in the video game. I don't know, it's funny. So, for the next question, what role do you think Elden Ring's greater accessibility has played in creating Kevins?
Kevins have probably always existed in some way, shape, or form. There's always been players who don't try to learn a game and suffer a hilarious amount of friction for it. The thing is, with Demon Souls or Dark Souls or Bloodborne, not learning the game was a serious obstacle. I've encountered so many people over the years who got stuck at some point in a Souls game and just could not figure it out. They were ignoring some critical mechanic or misunderstanding the game's logic, and the game was not letting them advance. Not to say every every character who gets stuck in a Souls game is a Kevin. Kevins are just those players who get stuck and don't learn anything from it. Where Elden Ring makes its mark is in how it handles Kevins. Instead of saying you need to kill this boss with what you have or you cannot advance, it gives you a near limitless number of workarounds. For example, the fact that there's no mandatory skill check at the start of the game has always stood out to me as setting Elden Ring apart tonally. The grafted scion is supposed to kill you full stop. You can kill it, but the reward is menial and the effort unappealing. Add to it all that you only get one try, and I can't imagine most folks going out of their way to test their mettle right out of the gate. And because you advance regardless, the lesson becomes less about overcoming adversity and more about picking your battle. The Tree Sentinel reinforces the same lesson. Fighting it right away is a fool's errand. Best to run past and return when you're ready.
People are like, just keep skipping him, skip him. Why? Why? This is part of the fun of the game, is overcoming a good challenge. I like this. I'm getting better at it. I'm gonna beat him. It's just a matter of time. Why are you guys yelling to skip the guy? I know I could beat him.
Compare that to something like Dark Souls 3, where you can't continue without beating the first boss. The achievement on Steam for defeating Yiddick's Gundyr only has like 85% completion. That means around 15% of people who own the game didn't even get past the tutorial. Getting stuck washed out a lot of would-be Kevins in Dark Souls. Elden Ring doesn't let you wash out. There's no point at which it forces you to learn any of its mechanics. If you don't want to learn spacing or how to identify an opening, you don't have to. You can stand behind your boys and stroll your way to victory.
You know, it's funny you mentioned Yiddick's Gundyr from Dark Souls 3 because I personally know someone who abandoned the game completely after not being able to beat him. And he was very casual about it as well. He didn't really complain or said that Yiddick's Gundyr should not be there. When I asked him, he just said, "No, you know what? I just could not beat him. I think it's just not for me." I do not know if he would have been a Kevin, but he certainly got filtered by it. So for the next question, will you say Elden Ring has failed Kevins by enabling them as opposed to previous Souls games?
In a lot of ways, absolutely. The sheer volume of resources at a player's disposal can spoil them, not only for choice, but by ruining their appetite for nuance. Ashes of War and spells are such major sources of damage that often fail to interact with other mechanics in a teachable way. L2 warriors didn't exist before Elden Ring because there wasn't any way to press a single button and get those huge returns. Spells have gotten faster, gained longer range, and do more damage. The argument can be made that Elden Ring necessitates those things because of how fast enemies are, but it's not hard to see why Kevins find spells so appealing. They stay out of harm's way, and more often than not, are handsomely rewarded. And summoning is so readily available, there's no good reason to bash your head against a difficult boss when you can just break the AI by adding a second player. In the event that you can't summon a friend, Spirit Ashes get the job done. These things let Kevins ignore fundamental mechanics, and so long as you have them in your arsenal, it might never occur to a Kevin to ever directly engage. It's important to remember that Souls games haven't historically been very intuitive. It takes trial and error to learn what works and what doesn't. But when you can get by with busted options and a little luck, there's no real incentive to understand what you're doing. And Kevins thrive in the obvious and the default. Elden Ring has just decided that those obvious defaults are also frequently the best, at least in terms of minimal input, maximum output.
But, John, summoning has been around since the beginning of Souls games. What changed to make it so universal among Kevins?
While summoning has always been available, it's never been easier. Passwords came in with Bloodborne and really took off with Dark Souls 3. Before that, you had to understand the invisible matchmaking formula, which ruled out Kevins wholesale. But Elden Ring took it a step further by removing the item requirement. You technically need a fur-calling finger remedy, but beyond needing to be crafted, they serve as a meaningless extra step. Not needing some precious resource like humanity or embers to enable summoning means there's nothing to balance. You just summon at every available opportunity, completely risk-free. If you die, you just do it again. The summoning pools and Stakes of Marika are also doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Not only can you be escorted through the entire level, but whenever you die to a boss, you can respawn right outside and re-summon. The desire to remove as much friction as possible has made summoning ubiquitous, in turn making the most efficient way to play being escorted. Suddenly, single player is almost a challenge mode, and anyone not actively seeking one out defaults to co-op. So it's no wonder Kevins and their chariots are so abundant. The summoning system was practically tailor-made to their specifications.
Yeah, summoning is pretty much everywhere, and it's also all you encounter in PvP. And speaking of PvP, Kevins tend to have a strong aversion to it. Has that been your experience?
I've never met a Kevin in PvP that I didn't pity. I know a lot of invaders won't attack them and instead try to give them some items or lead them through a level. I know because I've been that invader, but when we're highlighting that Elden Ring being too permissive with players is letting them stay Kevins forever, invading feels like the right counterbalance. And it's probably enigmatic of the average Kevin's aversion to PvP that the only counter to cooperation is invasion. I don't think it's exclusive to Kevins, but if I had a subscriber for every person who told me they were just trying to play the game and how much they hate invaders for ruining that experience, I'd have a much larger channel. Invading has always been and will always be a controversial mechanic. Guy comes out of nowhere and stabs you in the ass. Why you? Why now? To a Kevin, those questions don't have answers. Like everything in the game, it's just another thing that happens, and the fact that another player has any say in the matter makes them the bad guy. And invasions hit players the hardest who aren't willing to adapt. It's the ultimate version of an unexpected challenge, and if all you're willing to do is press the same button over and over, you're gonna be taught a lesson. The toughest thing for me is that I don't know how to reach them. PvP is something you have to apply yourself to, and if you're essentially on autopilot, it's never going to click. Which I find truly tragic. Invasions are the most unique mechanic in this series, and to know that a growing portion of the player base has zero interest in them is heartbreaking. I couldn't care less if someone wants to cheese a boss or get carried through the whole game for the sake of expediency, but I'll be damned before I stop caring about someone's ability to participate in the greatest of Souls traditions.
Yes, I think you're right. I think it's a shame that people do not see the wonders of invasions and what PvP can actually bring to the table instead of just, play the PvE until you get bored of it and do nothing else. And I think people should give it a try. It's not the end of the world if you lose.
It's not the end of the world.
And for the final question, do you see Kevins as a passing phenomenon, or do you see them as the future of the series?
There's a common sentiment that From Software has abandoned their roots and essentially sold out to appeal to a casual audience. With Elden Ring as attractive to Kevins as it is, it's a hard sentiment to ignore, and it can be even harder to accept because the things that appeal to Kevins are the same things that frustrate veterans. It seems almost inevitable that one group will give way to the other, and Elden Ring was a big step in Kevin's favor. But I'd like to think there's room in the space for both types of players. Elden Ring is really aiming for that middle ground between a hardcore, punishing experience and something that even the least competent players can get through, and I think that's a noble goal. It shows FromSoft doesn't want to ruin what they've built and maintain a sincere interest in growing both their audience and design philosophy. It might not always be in a direction everyone likes, but such is the nature of compromise. But they should proceed with caution. A game for everyone is a game for no one, after all. If they can't nail down a target audience, the integrity of the series could be at serious risk. And of course, I'd like to see the Kevins of today become the veterans of tomorrow, though that feels extremely unlikely. For that to happen, whatever balance future games strive for needs to be focused on encouraging players to engage with as many of the mechanics as possible, instead of just giving them a choose-your-own-difficulty adventure. Multiplayer existing as a purely optional aspect may well be the source of all Kevins. If the game could manage to make co-op a sidestep instead of an easy mode, there'd be no way for them to stay Kevins. PvP with proper incentives and facilitation could easily turn a terrifying outlier into the game mode of the century. If Fortnite can appeal to anyone aged 5 to 100, there's no reason to think Souls PvP couldn't be for everyone, Kevins included. Because Kevins are simply products of their environments. Whatever experience FromSoft wants to prioritize is going to determine that outcome. I'd like to see them hold their players to a higher standard while embracing as many playstyles as possible. There's a fine line between accessibility and enabling. FromSoft just needs to find it.
Just to be clear and to remind everyone one more time, anyone can play their game however they want, and Kevins can make out of their experience whatever they see fit. It's of no business to us if they decide to cheese the game or summon or do whatever the fuck they want. This was just a fun video talking about those silly gamers that we sometimes laugh at and realize where they come from and why they are here. No malice is intended towards them.
It's only a game.
Let's just keep that clear, okay?